Yes, I am finally in an armchair. This video is a giant leap in content that I was planning to ease people into over the course of months, but I realized that this video could lose relevance depending on Trump's peace deal terms, so I had to get it out now. My background is in political science, and I'm probably more knowledgeable in international relations than I am in martial arts, so hear me out. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, there have been people peddling the narrative that this conflict is somehow the fault of NATO, that NATO's aggressive expansion has made Russia view it as an existential threat, poised to surround Russia and destroy it. The narrative maintains that Russia was forced to invade Ukraine to stop NATO from putting a metaphorical knife to Russia's throat. This view has mainly been pushed by Russian bots and political scientist John Mearsheimer. I know, what's the difference? Anyway, I want to explain why NATO is not an existential threat to Russia, why NATO is not the cause of the war, and outline why Putin did decide to invade Ukraine, relying extensively on Putin's own words. Also, this is not a beginner-friendly video, nor do I care to make it one. To get the most out of this information, you should know all of these people and terms in at least reasonable levels of detail. First things first, NATO is not an existential threat to Russia. The best evidence for this is that NATO is a defensive alliance that does not act offensively without broad international support. I'm sure some of you are upset that I'm regurgitating NATO talking points, so let's get into the specifics. Those that claim NATO is aggressive point to three main instances: Bosnia, Libya, and Yugoslavia. Those are the main instances in which NATO conducted official NATO operations against people that did not attack NATO first. NATO actions in Bosnia were conducted at the behest of a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for military intervention in Bosnia, a unanimous Security Council resolution. Russia voted for NATO to intervene. Russia even participated in the NATO-led peacekeeping operation, meaning they approved of NATO's actions and worked alongside them. Okay, but what about the intervention in Libya? Another unanimous Security Council resolution. But this time, Russia abstained. And remember that Russia has a veto on the Security Council, meaning they could have stopped the resolution, but chose to let it pass. However, the real exception to this rule is Yugoslavia, where NATO did launch an air campaign without UN approval over fears that an ongoing ethnic cleansing could lead to regional instability. However, a Security Council resolution that Russia introduced to condemn the campaign was outvoted 12-3 because NATO's actions had broad international support. Not long afterwards, the Security Council passed a resolution explicitly calling for military intervention, which Russia voted in favor of. Military intervention, which NATO continued to participate in. Other non-Article 5 related uses of military force by NATO include leading a coalition in Afghanistan, which Russia voted for, and countering piracy near Africa, which Russia voted for. So if Russia is concerned about NATO taking military actions, maybe Russia should stop voting for it. Now we have to talk about the thing Russian apologists never seem to shut up about: NATO expansion. At a summit in 1990, Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush's administration promised Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union at the time, that he would not let NATO expand a single inch further east. And then NATO expanded further east. This is used as proof that NATO is an expansionist power that can't be trusted. However, the main problem with this idea is that it frames Bush's promise as a lie and a betrayal, which it wasn't. Bush 100% kept his word. He didn't want NATO to expand eastward, and it didn't, until Bush left office. Forgive me if what I'm about to say sounds like I'm talking to a 3-year-old, but I'm sick of people pretending to not understand this. You see, in a democracy, we have different candidates that advocate different policies. One candidate might say that NATO shouldn't be allowed to accept new members, and the other candidate might say, I don't know, maybe NATO should accept new members. And then the people vote and decide which candidate and set of policies they like better. The winner gets to make decisions, and the loser gets to go home and cry about it. And in 1992, George H.W. Bush got to go home and cry about it. Bill Clinton came into office, and his administration was willing to accept new members. Bush kept his promise, and Clinton never made one. Democracies often change course and adopt different policies. That's the point of having elections. No president can make promises on behalf of subsequent administrations. If they could, then we wouldn't have a democracy. Now, if an administration wants to make sure that future administrations are held to certain promises, then that administration can sign what's called a treaty. When a president signs a treaty and Congress ratifies it, then all of the future presidents also have to do what the treaty says. It becomes a promise made by the country instead of a promise made by some guy who might get replaced in a few years. And this promise to never expand NATO eastward was never a treaty, a law, or even a memorandum. It was a single administration's policy position. And Americans decided we didn't like those policy positions, so we fired the guy. Even the pro-NATO people I see talk about this issue treat it as some sort of lie or betrayal, when it simply wasn't. If the Soviets wanted that policy to be permanent, they should have asked for a treaty. In fact, the original promise Bush made was as a response to the treaty that united East and West Germany. The Soviets could have insisted that that clause be in the treaty that everyone was already about to sign. Even if they failed to think of it, Russia could have asked for those assurances in the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, since over 4 years after Bush left office, NATO still hadn't begun expanding. And I forgot to mention that in 1996, Bill Clinton formally announced that NATO would be expanding, meaning that Russia was fully aware of future NATO expansion when they signed the Founding Act in 1997. They were perfectly willing to deepen their relationship with NATO while knowing that NATO was going to expand. Either Soviet leadership was too stupid to realize what everyone else knew, and too stupid to ask for a treaty, or more likely, they could see that a permanent ban was simply a fantasy and were instead satisfied with Bush's indefinite moratorium. Even during George H.W. Bush's term, NATO expansion was never a question of if, but when. After the Cold War, U.S. realists wanted to preserve American influence and hegemony in Europe. U.S. liberals, foreign policy liberals, not leftists, big difference, wanted to spread Western values and maintain international organizations bent on European security. Western European powers wanted tighter European integration on security. Eastern Europe desperately wanted military assurances against a possible resurgent Russia, and everyone wanted whatever military structure or assurances were necessary to stabilize the many quickly fracturing post-Soviet states. NATO was the only thing that could satisfy all of these groups, and people knew this at the time. Bush Sr. was perfectly aware that his promise would not last forever. Now, did the Bush administration purposely downplay the seriousness with which expansion was being discussed and planned in the White House? Yes, they did. But subtly downplaying how often it was being discussed is a far cry from the diplomatic lies and betrayals that people often allege. If the Soviets had done the obvious thing and asked for a treaty, they wouldn't have been able to get one because such a document would require ignoring every geopolitical reality on the continent. Of course, once NATO did inevitably expand, this allowed former Soviet and Russian leaders to feign betrayal whenever it became politically convenient to do so. I understand that Russia has never had a functional democracy, so they might not intuitively understand that different leaders might be radically opposed to each other, but for Russia's highly educated and politically experienced leadership to pretend that they don't understand how democracies work is embarrassingly transparent. A president cannot make promises that extend past his term, and anyone with even passing knowledge of the American political system knows that. If you don't understand that staunch political adversaries in a democracy might pursue different policy objectives during their respective administrations, then you should not be allowed to run a country. Either Russian and Soviet leaders were okay with Bush Sr.'s temporary moratorium on expansion, using it to market themselves as both deal-making diplomats and betrayed victims, or they're genuine morons who could be geopolitically outmaneuvered by a child. Either way, it's difficult to take their positions seriously. Irrespective of your view on the legitimacy of NATO expansion, I think it's rather obvious that it was not an immediate cause of Russia's invasion. First of all, between 2010 and 2014, the application process was on hold as Ukraine formally pursued non-alignment under a pro-Russian president. Obama, Merkel, and Orban would have all happily blocked Ukrainian membership, and the odds of Ukraine joining NATO were now further away than ever. But Russia invaded anyway. They annexed Crimea and kicked Ukraine's efforts to join NATO back into gear. However, even that effort hardly mattered. You see, NATO has guidelines against letting states with active territorial disputes join the alliance. This includes irredentist claims and internal jurisdictional disputes. There are very good legal and political reasons to have these rules, and Russia's annexation of Crimea and funding of separatist movements in the Donbass created more than enough internal and external territorial disputes to make Ukraine's ascension into NATO highly unlikely, if not impossible. And in the subsequent 8 years, Ukraine didn't make much progress on that front. Their disputes didn't improve, and their NATO interoperability proceeded at a glacial pace. In the weeks before the 2022 invasion, US officials even reiterated to Russia that no one had any actionable plans for admitting Ukraine in the foreseeable future. Russia had, for all intents and purposes, successfully prevented Ukraine from joining NATO. But they invaded anyway. Since their invasion, Finland, the prototypical example of towing the line between East and West, has formally joined NATO along with Sweden, turning the Baltic Sea into a virtual NATO lake, an action that provoked Russia to do absolutely nothing. In fact, as NATO grew and tensions mounted post-invasion, Russia pulled military resources away from the Finnish border. They also pulled military resources out of Kaliningrad, their strategically vital enclave on the Baltic Sea. If Russia viewed NATO as a military threat, these actions would be completely suicidal. Russian apologists would have you believe that potential Ukrainian membership in NATO, which hadn't happened for 14 years and was basically impossible, was an immediate existential threat that justified invasion. But two historically neutral countries actually joining NATO are no real cause for concern, and Russia can actually deplete their border defenses and be totally fine. These puzzle pieces are not fitting together. The only way to explain this inconsistency is by acknowledging that a military threat from NATO is not the reason that Russia invaded, or at least not the main reason, meaning that people like John Mearsheimer are just objectively wrong. Now, this isn't to say that Putin is fine with NATO expansion. He obviously doesn't like it, but it's also obviously not the reason for his invasion. Now, if NATO isn't the reason for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, then what is? Well, in assessing the internal logic and rationale of Vladimir Putin, I believe there's no better source than Vladimir Putin. While Putin is a known liar, I think he's fairly trustworthy on this specific topic, because no one lies about their own ideology. Your personal ideology is what makes you the good guy in your own story. Lying about it just makes you sound like more of a bad guy. Because of this, I'm relying as much as I can on Putin's own words. I've read his paper on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, watched his 2007 speech at Munich, as well as the Tucker Carlson interview, read his address to the Russian Duma on the annexation of Crimea, and generally absorbed as much information as I can about his worldview. Unfortunately, I can't possibly explain every intricacy of Putin's worldview in regard to international relations, because doing so would require an incredibly long scholarly work. Simply critiquing his biased approach to history would take well over an hour and deserves the attention of an actual historian, which I am not. Not to mention his views on things like NATO, the Soviet Union, and his contradictory views on international law and self-determination. Instead, I want to stick to his views on Ukraine and the Russian political philosophies that drive them, which are most relevant to his motivations for the invasion. The first thing we need to understand is that Putin has an ethnically focused view of Russian history. He views Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians as part of the same fundamental people group, and believes that further separating or dividing these people along ethnic, cultural, or political lines is tantamount to a crime against history itself. That the people of the ancient Kievan Rus are fated to be united forever. You might recall Putin's comically long rant about Russian history during the Tucker Carlson interview. To people in the West, and even Tucker Carlson himself, this seemed like a bizarre diatribe with no real point. But the ethnic makeup, territorial claims, and cultural domination of a state 1,000 years in the past is genuinely one of the most important determining factors in Putin's worldview regarding Ukraine. And for the record, Putin's understanding of the ethnic makeup and territorial claims of the state are so heavily twisted as to be laughable. Here's a good video on the subject. Although Putin doesn't use these exact words, the best way to sum up his beliefs is with the idea that Russians and Ukrainians have a shared destiny. They don't necessarily have to be part of the same internationally recognized nation-state, but that's only because Putin doesn't always view the borders of nation-states as meaningful or legitimate. He looks at the world in terms of history and people groups. To him, whether you live in Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus is irrelevant, as you're all part of the same civilization anyway. You're all linked as an ethnic group with a shared history and a shared political destiny, whether you like it or not. Putin and other Russian leaders have remarked many times in the past that Ukraine is not a real state, and that's because any way in which they are divided from Russia is viewed as artificial and illegitimate. To quote from Putin's speech heralding the formal annexation of Crimea, "Do not believe those who want you to fear Russia, shouting that other regions will follow Crimea. We do not want to divide Ukraine. We do not need that. As for Crimea, it was and remains a Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar land." You can see Putin stressing his idea that Russians and Ukrainians are inseparable, as he views Russia taking control of land from Ukraine as not making it any less Ukrainian, as it will have the same political destiny either way. It's like how when I hire my friend to do side work, I typically send money to his wife's Venmo account. They share finances, so who gets the money is kind of irrelevant. Putin believes that Russia and Ukraine share a political destiny, so which nation administers the land is kind of irrelevant. And the fact that he completely broke his word and is now trying to seize 4 more oblasts is similarly irrelevant. Ultimately, NATO expansion is not what drove Putin to action. What drove Putin to action was Ukraine joining NATO, or more specifically, Ukraine wanting to join NATO. You see, Ukrainian membership in NATO isn't the cause of the war. It's a symptom of a political westward drift that Ukraine has been experiencing since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, and the string of pro-Russian presidents since has made that trend clear. As Ukraine gains closer economic, political, and security ties with the West, that threatens Putin's worldview of all Rus people sharing a political destiny. And if Ukraine gains the protection of NATO, Putin fears that Russia might be unable to militarily force Ukraine back to its proper destiny. When I explained this to my wife, she remarked that Russia sounds like a jilted lover who threatens to kill his ex-wife if she ever has a relationship with anyone else, because he's convinced that destiny demands that they be together. Not only is that a near-perfect analogy, but it also makes this meme I made even funnier. So if you have trouble understanding Putin's views on history, just imagine a crazy ex saying, "You and I are destiny. Other people are trying to steal you away, and if I can't have you, no one can." You would think that war and international relations would be a bit more rational than a romantic stalker, but that's not always the case. In Putin's mind, Ukraine becoming more westernized is a violation of destiny itself. Russia and Ukraine are linked by history and blood in a way that illegitimizes any attempt to separate them. And because he views Russia and Ukraine as the same people who are so fundamentally linked, he cannot conceive of a universe in which Ukrainians are pulling away from Russia voluntarily. And I'm not exaggerating here. If you read his article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he at no point gives any indication that Ukraine even has the capacity for agency. Nowhere does he even remotely entertain the idea that Ukraine might not want a shared destiny, or that Ukrainian desires matter or even exist. To Putin, it would be like your arm suddenly speaking up and saying, "I don't want to be part of this body anymore. I'm leaving." It's a ridiculous request that's impossible to fill and impossible for Ukraine to even ask. Appendages don't get to have opinions. To quote again from his address before the annexation of Crimea, Putin blamed the Euromaidan protests on nationalists, neo-Nazis, Russophobes, and anti-Semites. And I will draw your attention to the fact that he lumped Ukrainian nationalists, people who advocate for national unity or independence, in with neo-Nazis. To him, these are somehow the same level of evil. He also used his address to subtly allude to consequences for anyone trying to build a purely Ukrainian state, as he doesn't believe such a thing could even exist. Putin literally cannot imagine Ukraine choosing the West. No. It must be the result of evil masterminds puppeteering the Ukrainian government to steal its people away. Nefarious mesmerists that have hijacked the country and betrayed the Rus people in order to promote Western hegemony. It can only be George Soros and the CIA. Putin and other Russian leaders believed that the color revolutions, the mass protests and revolutions in post-Soviet states that sought to establish liberal democracies, were actually George Soros/CIA plots to overthrow unfriendly governments and had no relation to the will of the citizens. Every Ukrainian protest against Russian-backed politicians, every election win for a pro-Western leader, every pro-Western move the country makes, none of it is the result of Ukrainian citizens exercising political agency. It's all a CIA plot to destabilize unfriendly governments, further Western hegemony, and eventually balkanize the entire region. And if Russia doesn't act decisively, then they'll be next. The whole origin and progression of this theory is extremely convoluted, so I'd recommend Sarcasmatron's video on the matter, which goes into a lot more detail on its origins and why it's completely impossible. Trust me, the CIA wishes they were that good. When examining Putin's beliefs on the subject, even his article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians accuses NATO of direct external control over Ukrainian institutions and of stoking a climate of fear and militarization in the country. In Putin's mind, anything Ukraine does that opposes Russia is because of US/NATO control and influence. The Ukrainian people have no agency. They are either staunch allies of Russia, or they are bought and paid for by the West. All dissent is a CIA-manufactured smokescreen. And yes, I recognize that this theory is utterly detached from reality, but it not only is what Russian leaders believe, it also explains the massive miscalculation they made at the start of the invasion. You might remember that Russian troops went into Ukraine wholly unprepared for the stiff resistance that they encountered. They went in with the assumption that they would be hailed as liberators and assisted by the Ukrainian public at every turn. I've seen speculation that this might have been a miscommunication in which the Russian forces believed Putin's public rhetoric and propaganda, even though military leadership was supposed to prepare them for reality. Essentially, that the military mistakenly drank the Kool-Aid when they were supposed to be the only ones that got water. But I believe a much better explanation is that nearly every level of Russian leadership genuinely believed that they would be hailed as liberators. Because Putin believed that the pro-Western government in Ukraine was merely a puppet of the CIA, put in place against the will of a largely politically disengaged Ukrainian population. It logically followed that kicking in the country's door would cause the whole rotten structure to collapse. There was no miscommunication. Russian leadership truly thought this was reality. This is another mistake that John Mearsheimer makes when he claims that Russia never intended to overthrow Ukraine, on the basis that they didn't send nearly enough troops to militarily occupy it.
If Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument.
He assumes that Russian leaders thought they would have to occupy every inch of Ukraine, which they didn't. They thought the people would be on their side. All they needed to do was hit Kyiv in order to eliminate the pro-Western puppet and install a Kremlin-backed leader. And they expected the Ukrainian people to not only welcome them, but also actively support them as a kind of fifth column. In hindsight, this sounds absurd, but political leaders completely ignoring intelligence reports because of preconceived biases has plenty of historical precedent. Putin's belief in a CIA conspiracy also explains why the invasion took place at all. For those more versed in political science and political history, it seems obvious that a large-scale invasion would likely solidify a national identity that would make normal Ukrainians hate Russia for generations. Not something that would break Ukrainian identity or make them grow closer to Russia. However, the war was never meant to show Ukrainians that he means business and that they better behave or else. It was to show the West that he means business, to stomp and kill and bluster until the CIA and their political technologists realize that Russia won't allow their devious attempts at destabilization to succeed. In Putin's mind, Ukrainian identity could only be the result of Western meddling, making him much more concerned with scaring off the West than appealing to Ukrainians. His violence isn't meant to harm the damsel in distress, it's meant to frighten off the dragon that kidnapped her. The invasion is just bringing the Ukrainian and Russian people closer to their shared political destiny. The Ukrainian people should thank him. Any separate Ukrainian identity, resistance, protests, or political instability is solely the fault of the insidious West. Of course, when Putin's ideas about color revolution and Ukrainian agency ran headlong into the freight train of reality, he didn't question his beliefs or admit he was wrong. No, like any good conspiracy theorist, he just expanded the theory. The CIA's efforts to sow political discontent are even more devious than we believed. We must fight even harder to free our Ukrainian comrades. Even knowing this, the question remains as to why Putin believes these rather strange ideas. Is there an ideology that biases his thinking to these conclusions? Well, some people have argued that Putin's Russia has no philosophy or intellectual basis. It merely uses a smokescreen of intellectualism to disguise the fact that its ideology is whatever its leadership finds politically convenient. While I acknowledge that political leaders in all countries tend to have skin-deep philosophies that they can't properly source the origins of, I also acknowledge that leaders still often have philosophies, at least through cultural osmosis, and Russia is no exception. Russia may be a little crazy right now, but they are still capable of genuine political thought, and Putin's actions and motivations did not arise from a vacuum. They reflect a political and cultural context that is both influenced and expressed in the philosophy of the intelligentsia. In short, Putin's ideas had to come from somewhere, and as loose as these intellectual leanings might be, I think it's important to acknowledge them. One of the most widespread ideologies present in the Russian foreign policy sphere is Eurasianism, which frames Russia as a distinct blend of Europe and Asia. This ethno-cultural history emboldens Russia with the distinct destiny of ending Western hegemony, inevitably bringing it into conflict with the West. It envisions a shared destiny between Russians, former Soviet countries, and parts of Asia, which serves as clear inspiration for Putin's historical ideas. It also advocates that the geography of Eurasia naturally lends itself to the formation of empire. As you can see, the ideas of Eurasianism inevitably push Russia towards imperialist takeovers of much of Eastern Europe and Asia, as well as conflict with Western Europe and NATO, irrespective of whether Ukraine or any other post-Soviet nation is even a member of NATO. Another significant political philosophy in the Russian sphere is fascism, and I'm not using fascism as a pejorative or an attempt to mudslang, nor am I talking about the aesthetic elements like a single leader, mass rallies, dehumanizing people. I'm talking about the legitimate philosophical and intellectual tradition of fascism and how it's influenced Russian political thought. As a primer, here's a wonderful video on what fascism is, so you can stop using it as a political slur and start understanding it as a genuine intellectual tradition. Obviously, people can and have made hours-long examinations of whether Russia is fascist, but I'm just going to give you the cliff notes. A thinker that Putin personally quotes from and admires is Ivan Ilyin, who was a fascist. One of the main influences apparent in modern Russian legal theories on power is Carl Schmitt, who was a fascist. Also, consider the work of Alexander Dugin, the most famous philosopher in Russia, who has also never had an original idea in his life. However, because of that, he's quite useful in collating and summarizing the ideas already present in the Russian political sphere. His most famous book argues that Russia needs a new political theory that is not liberal, Marxist, or fascist. In developing his fourth political theory, he cites fascists, more fascists, a fascist again, and Karl Marx, whose only point of agreement is that liberalism sucks.
Every single idea Dugin advances, he got from German fascists, from Italian fascists, from French fascists, and from Karl Marx.
While I doubt that many Russian leaders would identify as fascists, their views and policies are still very clearly more than a little tinged in fascism. In the same way that the average American likely has no idea who Locke, Voltaire, or Kant are and thinks that liberal is synonymous with left-wing. Yet Americans almost unanimously have a worldview firmly rooted in the tradition of liberalism. Just because someone doesn't acknowledge their philosophical roots doesn't mean that they don't have any. So if Russian leaders are influenced by fascism, what do their beliefs actually entail? In short, Russia is great. History is only true if it affirms Russian greatness. Policies are only correct when they affirm Russian greatness. All thoughts, actions, and policy decisions must serve the greatness and power of the nation. And, of course, the nation of Russia isn't some lines on a map. It's their history, their lineage. It's the spirit, the soul, the feeling in the hearts of true Russians. If this sounds like metaphysical nonsense to you, you're right, but that's just what fascist philosophy sounds like to those of us raised in liberalism. Putin isn't so stupid as to be naively tricked into believing conspiracy theories. He chooses to believe them because his nation demands it. If Russia has a historic destiny, that would make it a great nation. Since it is a great nation, it must have a historic destiny. If other countries willingly reject Russia in order to westernize, that would mean that Russia is not a great nation. Since it is a great nation, those countries must be westernizing against their will. The ideas of shared destinies and CIA plots don't spawn from a mind that rationally looks at the facts of the world. They come from those who view everything through the lens of unquestionable Russian greatness. And if Russian greatness demands the facts, the goals, or the enemies change, then they will. This is why Putin's understanding of history seems so inconsistent. Not because he's stupid, but because the truth is whatever is necessary to further the greatness of Russia. And there is no limit on how great, powerful, and historically significant Russia should be. For various reasons, a lot of the major cultural touchstones, advancements, population centers, leaders, and intellectuals throughout Russian history, from the Russian Empire through the Soviet Union, are from what is now Ukraine. If Putin allows Ukraine to continue developing a national consciousness and sense of history separate from Russian history, all of that historical greatness gets taken away from Russia and is instead claimed by Ukrainians. To someone whose only loyalty is to Russian greatness, this series of events is entirely unacceptable. Russian historian, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce Russian names here, but I'm an Anglophone, Russian historian Alexander Diokov has summed up Russian thought on the subject well when discussing the denazification of Ukraine. When hearing this quote, keep in mind that Russian use of the word Nazi is closer to meaning enemy of Russia than denoting the actual political movement of National Socialism. Ukrainian Nazism is all about the Vyshyvanka, the Ukrainian language, and hatred of Russians. For those of you that don't know, the Vyshyvanka, which I should probably look up the pronunciation of, is an embroidered shirt specific to Ukraine. His point is that any cultural elements, such as fashion or language, that are distinct from Russian culture represent Ukrainian Nazism and must be violently stamped out. In the infamous article, What Russia Should Do with Ukraine, political technologist Timofey Sergitsev stated that denazification will inevitably also be de-Ukrainization, arguing that Ukraine should be split into several states to destroy the Ukrainian identity, an idea that Putin's former successor, Dmitry Medvedev, and National Security Advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, publicly agreed with shortly thereafter. And remember that Putin himself threatened anyone attempting to build a purely Ukrainian state. Putin even went so far as to state that forming an ethnically Ukrainian state would be equivalent to the use of weapons of mass destruction against us. This war is very explicitly about stamping out Ukrainian national identity and culture. Russia's aversion to Ukrainian identity has been clearly stated multiple times by Putin himself. Putin does not want a neutral Ukraine. He wants a completely Russified Ukraine, and he will settle for nothing less. The reason Putin invaded Ukraine and not other nations is because Ukraine is the most obvious target. It has a rich history that often intertwines with Russia, is also populated by Eastern Slavs, and it's not yet protected by NATO. Putin's ambitions don't stop at Ukraine. Ukraine just happens to be the low-hanging fruit. But once Russia takes Ukraine, Putin will naturally be looking for the next opportunity to enhance Russia's greatness. And Ukraine is far from the only nation with which Putin can claim a historical connection. Putin is willing to harken back to the 9th century to justify his invasion of Ukraine. Yet Poland, Finland, and the Baltic countries were controlled by Russia into the 20th century. People that think Putin will leave those nations alone are ignoring how the widespread influences of Eurasianism and fascism have contributed to a distinct expansionist form of Russian nationalism that will very explicitly stop at nothing less than global domination and the retreat of Western civilization. Literally the day after I recorded this, Russia's ambassador to Romania accused the country of turning Moldova into an anti-Russian outpost, which sets up an excuse for Russia to invade both of those countries. Let's just say I told you so. Unfortunately, to many people in the West, Russia's current foreign policy often looks a lot like offensive realism to the untrained eye. The states play dirty, amass power, demand spheres of influence, and always seek to gain an edge over their rivals. But realists are seeking to maximize their relative power. Russian nationalists are looking to maximize their sense of spiritual greatness. Realists are calculated, careful, and focused on the future. Russian nationalists are ideologically driven and focused on the past. Realists sniff out potential danger and opportunity. Russian nationalists sniff their own farts. Fascists and imperialists overreach, make illogical decisions, and often invite the kinds of balancing coalitions that realists are careful to avoid. Putin is not a true realist. He is not operating on the logic of realpolitik that people like John Mearsheimer want to ascribe to him. He is a Russian nationalist, and he can't be appeased or negotiated with because he would never honor any agreement that doesn't affirm the superiority of Russian civilization. And that doesn't leave much room for compromise. Mearsheimer thinks that Putin hates NATO because NATO is violating a great power's natural sphere of influence. Putin actually hates NATO because he believes in conspiracy theories in which the CIA is trying to balkanize Russia and undermine its political destiny and historic greatness. Mearsheimer thinks that Putin targeted Ukraine because it was about to join NATO. Putin actually targeted Ukraine because it was developing a distinct cultural identity. One of the lines that Mearsheimer repeats most often is that we need to look at the war from Putin's perspective. Yet, at no point has Mearsheimer himself ever done that. He assumes that Putin must be an offensive realist, just like him, without ever considering Putin's actual ideology, beliefs, or cultural context. He has made no attempt to understand Russian political thought and instead presents a completely counterfactual view of Putin's motivation, ironically viewed exclusively through Mearsheimer's own cultural lens. And he gleefully twists and outright ignores Putin's own words until he can Elmer's glue his own worldview on top of Putin's and proclaim that it fits. Remember that historical unity article I keep mentioning?
I think that July 12th, 2021 article that Putin wrote says exactly the opposite. Putin recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He recognizes the settlement, December 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and that he believes Ukraine's future is up to Ukraine.
Putin explicitly condemned Ukrainian nationalism multiple times. He regards the internationally recognized border that Ukraine left the Soviet Union with as Russia being robbed. And he leaves no door open for Ukraine's future to be anything other than strongly linked with Russia. How Mearsheimer managed to find completely opposite information to everyone else who's read that article is a mystery to me, but I encourage you to read it for yourself. Putin didn't invade Ukraine because he was trying to maintain the balance of powers. He invaded because he firmly believes in the superiority of his own civilization and his historical destiny of world domination. That's the real cause of the war. Not the West, not NATO, it's Russian nationalism. A leader who believes in a shared destiny of his people, who sees George Soros in every protest, and who heads a governmental structure that allows him to fill every position with like-minded Russian nationalists, until there's no one left in the chain of command with an objective grasp on reality. NATO didn't cause this war. all NATO did was give Putin a ticking clock where he must subjugate Ukraine or else NATO's Article 5 could eventually protect it forever. However, with Ukrainians' growing national identity and political drift towards the West, this war was bound to happen anyway, because a fully realized Ukraine is something Putin refuses to accept, whether it's in NATO or not. And that separate cultural identity is something that we in the West can neither control nor stop, meaning that appeasing Putin isn't even something we're capable of doing. This war was bound to happen so long as the Ukrainian people have political agency and a voice in their government. To Putin, merely the development of Ukrainian national identity is unacceptable. Promoting their own language is unacceptable. Demanding fair elections is unacceptable. Having their own fashion is unacceptable. Anything Ukrainians think or do that isn't a perfect match to Russia's foreign policy, domestic policy, cultural development, and national consciousness will be interpreted by Putin as resulting from a NATO and CIA puppet government and would justify an invasion anyway. And for those of you still partial to the NATO enlargement theory, I'll remind you that in February of 2022, Ukrainian membership in NATO hadn't gotten any closer. Ukraine had territorial disputes that could prevent its membership, and the Russian-aligned Hungarian government would have vetoed Ukraine's membership anyway. Ukraine had no chance of getting into NATO anytime soon, but Putin invaded anyway, because NATO membership was not the concern. His concern was Ukraine's westward political trend, which threatened his entire worldview on Eurasianist Russian greatness. If Putin is scared of NATO, it's only because NATO offers European nations an alternative to Russian subjugation. In fact, the only thing that could have prevented this war is NATO having admitted Ukraine earlier, as Article 5 protection would have given even Putin second thoughts. And I suspect that even Mearsheimer would have to admit that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if it meant triggering Article 5.
I think you're right that if Ukraine had been in NATO, that Putin would not have attacked NATO.
Right. NATO is not, and has never been, the cause of this war. But it is the only real solution. Russia once signed the Budapest Memorandum, agreeing to never invade Ukraine. And then they invaded Ukraine. And then we reset relations. And then they invaded Ukraine again. Even if Trump manages to force a negotiated peace on this conflict, Russia has agreed to peace in Ukraine before. The only thing preventing them from invading again would be giving Ukraine an Article 5 guarantee. We were fooled by the Budapest Memorandum. Shame on Russia. We were fooled again after they invaded Crimea. Shame on us. If we get fooled again by negotiating another settlement and still not getting Ukraine in NATO, then we're past shame. We're just perpetual suckers. If you like this content and want to continue supporting things that YouTube is very often going to demonetize, please support me on Patreon, link in the description. Also, while this is the first time I've sat in an armchair on this channel, it's not the first time an armchair has appeared on this channel. Tell me in the comments if you know which video it was.
Without NATO, it's not real independence for Ukraine, because he will come back. Everybody have to understand one thing: he doesn't want our independence, because in this case he's a loser.